One of Britain's most beloved TV stars was found living in a tiny, damp flat with mold creeping up the walls. No furniture except a single mattress on the floor, no savings, and barely enough money to buy bread. He had made millions laugh for 5 decades. He had starred alongside Hollywood royalty. And yet, in his final years, his famous friends had to organize a charity concert just to pay for his heating bills. That man is on this list, and his story is not even the saddest one here. Today, we are counting down 12 British TV icons who died completely broke. Stars who had millions of fans, who were household names, who lived lives most people could only dream of, and yet they ended their days with nothing. Some lost it all to gambling, some to tax bills the size of mansions, some to illnesses that drained everything, and some were simply cheated by an industry that refused to pay them what they were owed. Stay until the end, because number 1 will genuinely break your heart. These are the stars who died in rags. Dora Bryan, 2014, a modest retirement flat in Brighton, England, 91 years old, bedroom filled with prescription bottles, a single photo on the wall of her younger self, smiling. Let's start with a face that every British child of the 1970s remembers instantly. Dora Bryan was the queen of character acting. She was the eccentric, hilarious mother in The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin. She won a BAFTA for A Taste of Honey. She was a fixture on British television for over 40 years. But here's what nobody knew. In her later years, Dora Bryan was being evicted from her home. The woman who had entertained millions was being forced to leave because she couldn't afford the repairs. She had no savings. Her pension was barely enough for food. When she died in 2014, aged 91, her estate was worth practically nothing. She had outlived her money, and she had been slowly selling her own memorabilia just to survive. Her son described watching his mother, a national treasure, counting pennies in her final years. Fame had given her everything except financial security. On screen, she was warm, funny, beloved. Behind closed doors, she was scared. But Dora's story is almost peaceful compared to number 11. Peter Sellers, 1964, Shepperton Studios. Sellers is sitting in his dressing room, alone, counting his money after a day of filming. The man who made the world laugh cannot stop checking his bank balance. Peter Sellers was one of the most famous men on earth. He played Inspector Clouseau. He starred in Dr. Strangelove. He was friends with the Beatles, with the royal family. He earned millions. And by the time he died in 1980, he was bankrupt. Sellers had a gambling problem that nobody talked about. He would lose entire film paychecks in a single night at the poker table. He also made catastrophic financial decisions. He signed contracts that gave him a flat fee per film, meaning he got nothing from the massive reruns and merchandise sales. When he died, his estate was forced to sell his belongings just to pay his debts. He had spent his final years in a small London flat, terrified of answering the phone because it might be another bill collector. The man who could play any character, who could charm any audience, could not escape the one character he couldn't control, himself. And if you think gambling destroyed him, wait until you hear about number 10, Leonard Rossiter, 1984, a cold flat in Harrogate. Rossiter sits in an armchair, wrapped in a blanket, staring at his own television, watching a rerun of Rising Damp. He can barely afford the electricity to watch himself on screen. Leonard Rossiter was the star of 2 of the biggest British sitcoms in history, Rising Damp, The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin. He played Rigsby, the miserly, scheming landlord who made the entire nation laugh. Rossiter was a genius. He was in high demand, but the taxman destroyed him. Rossiter had spent his career in the era before modern financial planning. He earned enormous amounts, but he had also accumulated enormous tax debts. When the Inland Revenue came calling, they took practically everything. He was forced to sell his house. He had to borrow money to pay his own legal fees. And the worst part? Rossiter had always been a careful man. He wasn't a gambler, he wasn't a drinker, he simply didn't understand the system. By the time he died suddenly in 1984, age 57, he had been living in a rented flat with almost nothing to leave his family. His daughter later said that her father had worked his whole life to give us everything, and in the end, he had nothing. Number 9? That one is a tragedy of a different kind. Patrick Troughton, 1987, a small council flat in South London. Patrick Troughton, the second Doctor Who, is sitting in a room filled with cardboard boxes. His TV is broken. He can't afford to fix it. Patrick Troughton was the second man to play the Doctor. He took over from William Hartnell and defined the role for a generation. He was a huge star in the 1960s and 1970s, but the BBC paid its stars flat fees in the 1960s. No residuals, no repeats. When Doctor Who became a global phenomenon and was repeated constantly, Troughton received almost nothing. Meanwhile, his personal life fell apart. He had 3 divorces and a series of failed business ventures. In his later years, he was forced to sell his BAFTA awards just to pay rent. He died in 1987, aged 67, living in a flat that he couldn't afford to leave. His own son was the one who discovered how little money he had. Troughton had been too proud to ask for help. He spent his final years in silence, watching his legacy grow while his bank account shrank. Number 8 is a name everyone knows, but what happened to him will shock you. Robert Newton, 1956, a tiny apartment in Beverly Hills. Robert Newton, the man who gave the world the term pirate accent, is drunk, alone, and sick. Robert Newton was the voice of pirates. He played Long John Silver. He invented the classic pirate voice. He was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood in the 1950s. And he drank himself into absolute ruin. Newton's alcoholism was legendary, even by Hollywood standards. He would show up to sets drunk, be fired, and then drink even more. His behavior destroyed his reputation. He struggled to get work. When he died in 1956, aged 50, he had absolutely nothing. He had spent every penny he ever earned. His daughter had to raise money for his funeral. The man who had defined pirate culture for all time died penniless and forgotten. Number 7? That's the one that made me cry writing this. Diana Dors, 1980, a small bedsit in London's West End. Diana Dors, Britain's answer to Marilyn Monroe, is looking at a photo of herself in a tiara. The jewels are all gone. Diana Dors was the blonde bombshell of British cinema. She was the biggest star in the UK in the 1950s. She was called the British Marilyn Monroe. She had everything: beauty, fame, fortune. But by the time she died in 1984, aged 52, she was practically broke. Her money had been drained by a series of bad relationships, terrible financial advisors, and her own generosity. She had given money away to friends who never repaid her. She had also been heavily taxed on income she never actually received. In her final years, Dors was living in a modest flat, relying on benefits, and selling her own jewelry just to pay medical bills. The woman who once had diamonds around her neck was counting coins for bus fare. Number 6 is a story of an industry that cheated its own stars. Michael Crawford, 2012, a quiet flat in London. Michael Crawford sits alone, looking at a photo of himself in the Phantom of the Opera mask. The royalty checks stopped coming years ago. Michael Crawford made more people cry and cheer than almost any stage actor in history. He was the original Phantom in the Phantom of the Opera. He made millions on Broadway. He was a household name. And yet, when the Phantom ended its initial run, Crawford was forced to take out loans to pay his debts. Andrew Lloyd Webber refused to give him a share of the show's massive ongoing profits. Crawford fought for years to get what he was owed. By the time he reached his 70s, he was living on a basic pension. The man who had sold out every show for years was struggling to pay his electricity bill. It took him decades of legal battles just to claw back a fraction of what he deserved. Number 5? That's the one that will genuinely make you angry. Charles Hawtrey, 1988, a small flat in South London. Charles Hawtrey, the tiny, bespectacled comedy genius from the Carry On films, is sitting alone. No visitors, no money, no hope. Charles Hawtrey was the comic relief of the Carry On films. He was tiny, funny, and beloved. He made people laugh for decades. But Hawtrey had a secret. He was an alcoholic, and his alcoholism got worse as he aged. He became unreliable. Producers stopped hiring him. He spent his final years in a small flat isolated, drinking himself to death. When he died in 1988, aged 73, he had almost no money. His funeral was paid for by the charity of the Actors' Union. The man who had filled cinemas across the country died with nothing but a worn-out memory of his own fame. Number 4 is a story of a woman who gave everything to her fans and got nothing in return. Barbara Windsor, 2020, a modest flat in London. Barbara Windsor, the icon of British film and television, is cared for by her husband. The money is gone. Barbara Windsor was the biggest star of the Carry On films. She was a national treasure. She was in EastEnders. She was beloved. And by the time she died in 2020, aged 83, she had been financially depleted by years of illness and poor investments. She had to be supported by her husband and by her old colleagues. The people she had worked with had to raise money just to pay for her care. The industry that had made her famous did almost nothing to support her. Number 3 is the man who was too proud to ask for help. Roger Lloyd-Pack, 2014, a quiet flat in North London. Roger Lloyd-Pack, Trigger from Only Fools and Horses, is quietly selling his belongings. Roger Lloyd-Pack played Trigger, the dim-witted road sweeper who called Rodney Dave. He was one of the most beloved characters in British comedy history. And yet, by the time he died in 2014, aged 69, he was living in a small flat, deeply in debt. He had been suffering from pancreatic cancer for years, and the medical bills had drained everything. The man who had been in one of the most repeated shows in British history received almost nothing from the endless reruns. He died without a will, leaving his children with almost nothing. Number 2 will make you furious. Oliver Reed, 1999, a hotel room in Malta. Oliver Reed, the wild man of British cinema, is counting his last few coins. Oliver Reed was one of the most famous actors in the world. He starred in Gladiator, The Three Musketeers, Women in Love. He was a legend, and a legendarily heavy drinker. Reed had earned tens of millions of pounds in his career. But by the time he died in 1999, aged 61, he had almost nothing. His drinking had cost him most of his money and almost all of his friends. He had spent his final years in a tiny rented flat, drinking himself to death, with no savings and no plan. When he died during a drinking contest in Malta, his estate was practically empty. The man who had been a Hollywood star died with less than £10,000. Number 1? This one will genuinely destroy you. Richard Beckinsale, March 1979. A small house in London. A 5-year-old girl is sitting on the floor, playing with her toys. She doesn't understand why her mother is crying. Her father is not coming home. Richard Beckinsale should have been one of the biggest British TV stars of all time. He played the charming, roguish Lenny Godber in Porridge, one of the greatest sitcoms in BBC history. He was adored by millions. He was handsome, brilliant, and destined for greatness. And then, on March 19, 1979, he dropped dead, age 31, a heart condition nobody knew about, no warning, no time to say goodbye. Beckinsale had not yet had time to build savings. His career had barely begun, and so when he died, his young family, including his 5-year-old daughter, the actress Kate Beckinsale, were left with nothing. No insurance, no estate, no money. The fortune that should have followed from years of reruns, from Porridge becoming one of the most repeated shows in history, never arrived. There were no residuals in the 1970s. There was no safety net. His wife had to rely on charity. His daughter grew up watching the reruns of her father's shows, knowing that the nation loved him, but also knowing that the nation's love hadn't paid his bills. Richard Beckinsale didn't lose his money to gambling, or illness, or bad decisions. He lost it to time. He lost it to an industry that didn't care about its actors after they stopped breathing. He had fame, he had talent, he had everything in the world, except the one thing he needed: enough time to build a future for his family. 12 lives that millions of people watched, loved, and admired. And 12 examples of how fame, no matter how bright it burns, is not a safety net. Gambling, taxes, illness, unfair contracts, industry neglect, bad decisions, bad luck. The reasons are all different, but the result is the same. These stars gave us joy, and they got nothing in return. If this video moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. We'll keep telling these stories, because the people who made us laugh deserved better, and the least we can do is make sure they are not forgotten.